Learning how to create new wall types is a very important concept in Revit that, once mastered, will help you understand how Revit categorizes and organizes the objects that you model to create a building. But first, let's look at how Revit thinks about a wall. To help illustrate this, I have created this image. Let's take a look at the center image for now. This is how Revit thinks about a wall. Different planes stacked together, or layers stacked and connected together. As far as Revit's concerned, each layer just has a thickness, from here to here, and it also has surface patterns and cut patterns. To us, what that translates to is, for an example, the red layer here might be our 2x studs, and that is the 2x stud layer. The black layer on the inside might be the gypboard, and the two blue layers on the outside might be the plywood sheathing with stucco on the outside face. If we happen to cut a detail cut through this and look down, so we see this in floor plan view, then we might look at the stud layer. What you might notice the difference between how Revit thinks about a wall and in the real world is Revit sees this stud layer as just a plane. But in reality, studs are built every 16 or every 24 inches inside this plane. And it's really not a solid plane at all in real life. It's an airspace filled up with studs, spaced evenly, and then usually some insulation in between. But we don't usually model all these studs or the insulation. The reason being is you don't hardly ever see them when you're looking at a model or the drawings that are created from the model. You only see the studs in detail cuts and maybe some section cuts. So therefore, the way we most often draw in Revit is we create the wall like Revit does with a plane, and then as soon as we get a detail or a section cut, we fill in the studs and the insulation with two-dimensional line work. In addition to that, Revit wants to look at surface patterns. So if we're looking at the gypboard layer, Revit wants to show the surface pattern to the user, and so we might define the gyp layer material as having, stipple all throughout the layer. So whenever we see the face view of this gypboard layer, Revit will show us a stipple pattern to represent gypboard. Now that we know how Revit thinks about a wall and defines a wall, let's take a look at how the user, us, can define the wall for Revit. That way we can create any wall type that we need for our project. The minimum amount of layers that you can define a wall with is one layer surrounded by two core faces. Revit by default has two core faces for every wall. You cannot delete these core faces, and there has to be some sort of layer inside of these core faces. Most often, that core layer is your stud wall layer. And then you build up layers going from the core to the exterior or the core to the interior. From our example before, we might have a gypboard layer on the interior here, followed by a core face, followed by the stud layer, another core face, and then two more layers towards the exterior, one being plywood and one being stucco. One of the important things about these core faces is this is how Revit shows or creates the walls as you model them. You can dimension to or draw the walls from a center line of the core face or from the core face itself, either one, or you can do it from the exterior finish face, the exterior inner face, or actually the center line of the wall itself. As you can see, if you take the midpoint of this line, that is not the same thing as the center of the core face. It just depends on what you need to use the dimensions or the layout of the walls for. So now let's take a look at how we apply this to Revit. Like I mentioned before, to create our own wall type, we start with a wall, and we'll modify that. One of the tricks here is to start with a wall that most closely resembles the wall type you want to create. We have created a wall type of generic 8 inches, but let's change that to something near what we wanted to make. Let's pretend we want to make a wall type that resembles what we were just looking at. A 2x stud core center with chipboard on the interior and plywood and stucco on the outside. We can change this wall type once we've selected it from the drop-down menu from the Properties palette. And we can look for a wall type that is similar to our stucco and wood stud wall that we want to define. Let's go ahead and pick the EIFS on metal stud. EIFS is an exterior insulation finish system. It is sort of like stucco on top of insulation. But it has a metal stud layer, and as you can see from the picture that just showed up, there's chipboard on the interior. So by highlighting this generic 8-inch wall, if we just click this EIFS on metal stud wall type, that wall has changed to the EIFS wall type. We can check that by selecting it and looking here. Now we can't see the individual layers even when we zoom in, and that is because we do not have the view detail set past coarse. If we change it to medium, we can start to see the layers that defines this wall. But we need to look more closely and define it exactly what we want. To do this, we highlight the wall and go to the Type Properties. That's here. Remember, you have to select the wall first so that the Properties palette shows you the properties and parameters of that wall. And then you go to the Type dialog box to change the type properties. Now, to create different wall types, we'll be talking about the structure. This is where we'll be editing the structure of the wall to make it what we want. Good Revit practice, however, says we should change the name of this before we move on. You can change the name by either duplicating it or renaming it. The difference is, if you duplicate it, you will keep the exterior EIFS on metal stud wall type within your Revit project, and you will add to it this new wall type that we want to create. If you rename this wall type, you will change this actual wall to a new wall name, and the EIFS on metal stud will no longer exist in the Revit file. So let's go ahead and duplicate it so we can keep the EIFS on metal stud wall type. And when you duplicate it, you get this dialog box, and we will rename it. Let's go ahead and rename this stucco on wood stud with chipboard. And that's the wall type we will create. We will go to the structure of this wall type, and we will edit the structure here, and that is how we create our new wall types. You can see that the definition of the wall is created in here with all the different layers, going from the interior side, working your way up to the exterior side. Now, the wall type that we had picked is defined by all of these layers. Let's get rid of a few that we don't need. The membrane layer I'm going to delete both places, and the thermal air layer. That leaves us with going from the inside. the chipboard layer. Here is our core boundary, our stud layer, our other core boundary or core face, followed by plywood, and then ephes. So we don't need to change too many layers to make the wall the way we want it. Let's start with chipboard. So starting on the interior side, we have chipboard. Let's change the thickness. Every layer will have to have a thickness, and we'll change it to 5/8 of an inch. Moving on up, we get to the core boundary. That has no thickness. The two core boundaries are just that. They are boundaries or faces, so they have no thickness. And they're grayed out, which means you cannot modify them. We get to the stud layer. Now this is a metal stud layer, so we want to change that to a wood stud layer. So we need to change the material and the thickness. Well, the thickness, if we use a 2x4, is actually 3.5 inches. And then to change the material, we can highlight the metal stud layer and click this radio button right here, and that will get us to the material library, material browser. Now we can search for wood, and if we scroll down, well, it's not here. So we can just say softwood lumber. That's fine. Hit OK. And now we have a lumber material. We could do this. We could go back to our material, right click on softwood lumber, duplicate it, and call this our wood stud layer. Hit return, and now that is what we'll use. That's more correct. And we will learn about the material browser and editing materials at a later time. We hit OK, we can see that we have a wood stud layer that's 3.5 inches thick. Then we get to our other core boundary, followed by plywood sheathing that's 3/4 of an inch thick, so that's fine. And then the very last material that we need is stucco. Stucco is not 3 inches thick, it's 7/8 inch thick, so we'll change the thickness. And then we'll go find stucco. If we search for stucco, there are none, but we can see it down here. We can use this arrow to bring it up into our project, and then we can use stucco. Let's go back to that material, stucco, and see if it has any surface patterns or colors. Let's change the surface pattern to something that looks like stucco. How about sand? And we can give the wall a different color, maybe a light brown. So it's not just gray. And I'm going to make the sand a little bit darker so it shows up a little bit more. So that was our stucco. So now we have finished defining our new wall type. We created layers with new materials, making sure that we have a layer that's within the core boundary. Within the core boundary. And we made sure that every layer has a thickness. We hit OK and OK and OK. We can zoom in and we can see that we have the different layers. Let's take a look at it in 3 dimensions. If we change this to consistent colors and we spin it around, we can see that the stucco side has a stucco pattern, the sand that we picked, and the brown. And that is how you create your own wall type. Again, if you highlight it, you can see that we have created a new wall type that shows up in the drop dialog box. This was not here before. Once we defined it, remember when we duplicated the wall type through the type properties, we named it stucco on wood stud with chipboard. And once we renamed it, once we duplicated it and renamed it, then we redefined it and we got this wall. The last wall type that we would want to look at in this video is a stacked wall. A stacked wall is nothing more than taking 2 previously defined wall types, like this one, and stacking them on top of each other. And so in Revit, when you draw a wall, it'll draw both of those walls together as one. That way you don't have to spend a lot of time creating a wall that is, say, 3 feet tall of one type, and then coming in on top of that wall later with a different wall type and making sure they are all lined up. The first thing you need to do in creating a stacked wall type is to make sure that the two wall types you want to use for the new stacked wall are already existing in the Revit project. Well, let's pretend that we're going to create a stacked wall that consists of a CMU wall, that's a concrete masonry unit wall, of 3 feet high below this wall type. Well, we know this wall type, the one we made, the stucco on wood stud with chipboard, already exists in the Revit file. We know that because we just made it. But what about the CMU wall type? If I type in WA for the wall command, I can go to my drop-down menu and look for a CMU wall. This generic 8-inch masonry is the same thing as a CMU wall. CMU stands for concrete masonry unit, and that's what these things are. You might recognize these as what you use to make a bookshelf with a piece of plywood over them in a dorm room. So now we know that we have two wall types that we want to stack together. The next thing we need to do is create or model another wall, and this one will be the stacked wall type. You find that at the very bottom of the drop-down menu, and here it is, stacked wall. Revit by default comes with an exterior brick over CMU with metal stud stacked wall. Let's go ahead and model that. And you can see that it has a CMU on the bottom with a brick wall on top. I didn't have to draw the CMU separately from the brick wall, and that's the point of the stacked walls. Well, I'm going to take this wall and I'm going to edit the type, and I'm going to duplicate it so I can now have my stucco with wood stud over CMU. That is going to be my new stacked wall type. You can see that the system family is a stacked wall, and I have just renamed it stucco with wood stud over CMU. Now if I just stopped at that and said OK and OK, and then I did wall command, and I picked the one that we just created, the stucco on wood stud over CMU, what is it going to look like? It's going to look like exactly like the other wall that we just created or used to create this one, the brick over metal stud. It looks like that because even though we duplicated and renamed our new stucco on wood stud over CMU wall, we didn't change the type. We didn't redefine it at all. So let's go do that now. We'll highlight the wall and go to Edit Type. Now you can already tell that the stacked wall type looks a little bit different. There's not nearly as many type properties. In fact, there's only one, the structure, within the type properties dialog box. If we go to edit the structure, again, it looks different. Now we're looking at, instead of layers with a core boundary, two core boundaries here, we're looking at just two wall types that we will use to stack on top of each other. Well, we already have the CMU on metal stud, except for I said that we wanted to use the generic masonry, not generic, the 8-inch masonry. And that'll be the bottom. You go from the base down here, oops, sorry about that. You go from the base and you work your way up. So this is at the bottom. You work your way up. Here's your next wall type to the top. Okay, so it tells you right there. So let's change this to our generic 8-inch masonry. The next column is how tall we want it. By default it's 3 feet, so that's fine. And now let's go and change the top wall. This is brick on metal stud, and we want the one that we just created, which was exterior stucco on wood stud with chipboard. And we'll keep this variable, this height, as variable. That's so it can attach itself to roofs or ceilings or floors one of the layers layers in the height column always has to be variable. If you click this preview button, you can take a look at what it's starting to look like. And you can see that we have stacked a stucco wall on top of a CMU wall. You can see that this is the stud layer, this is the chipboard layer, plywood, and stucco. This looks good to me, with just a little bit of edge between the stucco and the CMU. If you wanted to push the top wall one way or the other, that's when you would use the offset button. You could offset this 2 inches and it pushes it back. And you might use that to line up the chipboard with the CMU wall. I actually liked how it looked, so we'll keep it at 0. Hit OK, hit OK, and now we have our own stacked wall.